Hello, I hope your September is off to a great start so far. Welcome to my mid-month update. I had a wonderful highlight at the beginning of the month. I was on Steve Talks Books and was on his Friday Conversations along with Jimmy from the Fantasy Network, Philip Chase, and Stephen Erickson, author of Malazan Book of the Fallen and several other books. It was amazing to hear Stephen Erickson's insights as an author. He shared a passage from his upcoming book, No Life Forsaken, and he shared so many insights regarding characterization, implementation of theme. I was so inspired by it. There were so many highlights. I lost my train of thought at one point. It was very embarrassing, but I think it kind of worked out because when I got my train of thought back, I actually added in more personal context than I was initially going to do, and I think that just made the conversation all the more meaningful. So if you want to check out that replay, it's over on Steve Talks Books. I highly recommend subscribing to Steve's channel, by the way, if you're not already subscribed. He has some fantastic discussions and guests on his channel, and he asks the best questions. And I think there's a whole art to that. It's one thing to have an answer for everything, but a whole other thing to ask a very meaningful question. And so he does this in his live discussions, but he also does this in his weekly updates. So definitely subscribe to Steve's channel. He's wonderful. It was such an honor to be a guest again on Friday Conversations and to have such a wonderful time with these wonderful people. So aside from that, I also started out the month with my Elric reread. So I think I mentioned this in a previous video, but I am rereading the Elric saga. These are stories that I read when I was a teenager, and I'm using this new edition that was gifted to me from Evie from She Was Only Evie. And so I started out with reading the first story, which is Elric of Melniboné. I hope I'm saying that right, and if I'm not, I'm sorry. I got some advice from Twitter though. Anyway, this first story was fascinating. I did read Epic Pooh, which is Moorcock's his critique essay on epic fantasy, kind of saying that it's a lot like Winnie the Pooh meets an epic journey. And so he's being very darkly humorous in that essay and critical. But I think it was useful to read that before getting into these stories because I could definitely see how he was going in a different direction with the tragic elements. I think that Elric actually is a very tragic character, and the whole theme of destiny is pretty tragic in this series too so far. But I love it. I love his rich tone and atmosphere and some of the weirder things that he creates in this world. There is a magical sword trope. I love a good magical sword trope, but the way he does it is so creative. There is one of the best sword fights I've ever read in fantasy in this story, in this first story. So I had a lot of fun revisiting this. I'm going to be discussing this. This is part of a read-along with She Was Only Evie, Sarah from Sarah Reads, and Andrew from Andrew's Wizardly Reads, and I think Liam from Liam's Lyceum is joining us. And by the way, Liam did a fantastic overview video on Epic Pooh, that essay. I just Google searched the essay, by the way. You could find it if you do a search for it. But he did a wonderful, wonderful video on it. So I'm going to go ahead and link his video down in the description. Definitely check it out and subscribe to him. He does fantastic videos, especially on sword and sorcery. So highly recommend his channel. And aside from that, I also read and reviewed Babel by R.F. Kuang. So I actually started this at the end of August. I picked it up on my birthday, which was the release day. And I liked this. I didn't love it, but I explained why in my spoiler-free review. If you're curious, please check that out. I did appreciate a lot of the heavier themes that Kuang explores in this book and the sort of quote-unquote project of the book. I know a lot of booktubers use that terminology. So where it fell flat for me, I do explain in that review, but I did feel a little distanced from the characters, and some of the approaches she took were not my favorite approaches, but I know I'm in the minority and I don't want to take away from anyone's love and appreciation of this story because I know it's resonating for so many people right now. And I'm not the most well-read when it comes to dark academia. I did read Vita Nostra earlier this year, and even though I had some mixed feelings about the very end of Vita Nostra, I thoroughly enjoyed it and actually enjoyed the psychological angle of that particular story. It's also a critique of universities, but in a different way. And then the other dark academia book I read was Ninth House, and that was a few years ago. And I also really enjoyed that. That was set in Yale University. It's not historical, it's more modern times, and it does deal with secret societies. And I did also enjoy just the atmosphere of that journey. And so that was actually a very memorable read for me, even though I do remember having some slight criticisms of that book as well, but I really enjoyed it. So I'm not the most well-read in dark academia, but I am glad I read this overall. Definitely check out my review if you want more of my thoughts on that. Aside from that, I also read Fairy Tale by Stephen King, and I picked this up on release day, or rather downloaded it. And if you have a physical copy, the ebook copy also has the illustrations at the beginnings of chapters and the dedication at the beginning to Robert E. Howard, Edgar Rice Burroughs, and H.P. Lovecraft. Those are three very influential writers in the fantasy genre, and there are so many literary references throughout Fairy Tale, not only to those authors, but also to just a lot of different types of fairy tales, Disney fairy tales and Grimm fairy tales, classic fairy tales. It also brings up other kinds of references to King's own works and The Rhyme and the Ancient Mariner and one of the Robert Frost poems. So like I said, a lot is in that particular book, but this follows the character of Charlie. He is born in 1996, and he is telling this story in first person past tense as an adult in present day, but it mostly takes place when he was 17 years old, so around 2013. His mother had died at age 10 of a tragic car accident, and his dad self-medicated his grief with alcohol. But his dad overcomes that through going to AA and finding a support group, and as a result, Charlie seems to feel like he owes God or life or something for the good fortune that he has found at that stage in his life. So he's coming home from baseball practice one day when he discovers a Mr. Bowditch is a person who lives in this old historic manor, kind of a creepy place. And Mr. Bowditch has fallen from a ladder and he's aging. He has an aged canine named Radar. He's very much a recluse, but he's in need, and Charlie helps him out and ends up kind of in this caregiver role for Mr. Bowditch, even though Charlie doesn't see himself as a caregiver. And so this whole first part of the book is Charlie interacting with Mr. Bowditch, this elderly man, the aging canine Radar, and Charlie's father. And so it is very much slice of life, coming of age. And you notice that I didn't even bring up any of the fantasy elements yet. Those take place more towards the second half of the book, and there is a portal. It is a portal fantasy. The fantasy elements were, without giving away too much, they were really interesting. I did think they were very whimsical, kind of playing off the fairy tale theme here, and it kind of reminded me almost of a Disney Pixar film in some ways, the ways he described some of the visual landscape elements and even some of the ways that the people were described in this world. And I enjoyed that. However, there was a whole section in the book that was a whole event and introduces a ton of secondary characters, and I didn't quite connect to that part of the story. I understood what King was trying to do with that part of the story and how he was trying to bring out certain aspects of Charlie's character and getting Charlie to integrate with certain aspects of his identity. But unfortunately, I just didn't connect to any of the characters, and I didn't find this particular event as entertaining as I think it was intended to be. And I think the end actually worked for me. And then there was the epilogue, which I'll get into here in a minute. First, I want to say something kind of weird about this whole experience is that, of course, I picked this up on release week, so it was very exciting to be part of this buzz of people getting into this book at the same time and sharing thoughts and getting excited. And the weird thing about it is I was almost halfway through the book when other people were finishing the book right away. A lot of people were coming out right away saying, disappointing second half, or 3.5 stars, great first half, mediocre second half, or underwhelming second half. I just saw a ton of people, well, a handful of people say that who had finished the book early. And I just wanted to go against the grain so badly because I was enjoying my time. I didn't want to be disappointed. So I was kind of hoping that I could love this book. And unfortunately, I found myself having the same experience as pretty much everyone I talked to in this corner of BookTube. Now, I'm sure there are people who will love the heck out of this whole entire book, and there will be those people who hate the entire book. But it seems like everyone I've spoken with has had the same experience of really enjoying the first half of the book and not quite connecting with that middle or second half section of the book that I'm talking about, especially with all those secondary characters. And so it's so strange that there is so much agreement about that. Now, like with Babel, I'm very much in the minority with how I felt about this book. But with Fairy Tale, I just seem to align with what I've heard from everyone. And so there are a few people who've already reviewed this book who I'll point to in my description. Mike from Mike's Book Reviews did a fantastic spoiler-free discussion of this book, and he really highlighted a lot of the strengths of the book. And that's important to note because it's not a bad book. In fact, the majority of the book is actually very, very good. King did an amazing job with character work, especially with Charlie developing this relationship with a very guarded old man, and the character work between Charlie and his father and the dog Radar. And I love how each section of his interactions with these different characters ended with a very thoughtful idea or quote. So some memorable quotes that were passed along in conversation were things like, miracles aren't magic, and a brave man helps, a coward just gives presents, and discretion is the better part of valor. Quotes like that, I love things like that people will say. And so there were some wonderful passages, and again, a lot of nods to fairy tales throughout the story, as you can imagine. But it's just really strange, the parts that didn't seem to work for almost everyone I know. Let me know if you're in the minority about that. If you really loved the entire book, I'd love to hear from you. And then the other thing to mention, though, is that I do have one nitpick that I know is not going to bother everyone. Didn't bother most people, just bothered me for some reason. And that is that, as I said, this is told from Charlie's perspective in present day. So he's not 17 when he's telling the story, but as he's telling the story, he's kind of giving you the view of himself as a 17-year-old. And that was kind of a problem for me because there were several parts of this book that I got pulled out of the story thinking, this is King inserting himself so hard in Charlie's perspective. I don't really believe a 17-year-old is having these insights. At the same time, the insights were kind of connected to some of the charm of the book. So I did feel a little mixed about it, but it did keep pulling me out of the story in the second half. Whereas in the first half, I was so impressed with Charlie's character. And then in the epilogue, he basically explains what I was having issue with, but by trying to explain it and justify it, he contradicts what he says earlier in the story, or some of the reasons he gives earlier in the story. So I don't want to say any more just in case I give away any spoilers. It's just the way he presented it in the narrative, in the story, that didn't quite align. It kind of contradicted itself, like I said. But whatever. I mean, it was still fine. I'm still glad I read it. I still liked it, like I said. It was just interesting to be part of this conversation and just hear so many similar perspectives, especially about that section of the book I mentioned. Anyway, aside from that, I am past the halfway point in Excalibur, Book 3 in the Warlord Chronicles. Loving it so far. And aside from that, after that, I will be picking up Sons of Darkness. So Sons of Darkness will be my next read after Excalibur. I'm looking forward to it. And that just about covers it for now. So please let me know what you've been reading and how your month is going so far. Thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.